actually can change and can obviously improve the overall PSU bank space.
Professor Rammohan, you think the new government, if it is NDA and if it is led by Modi, a lot of big ifs over there, but if that happens, really they will be able to depoliticize bank boards. I mean, Mr. Piyush Goyal himself was an independent member on this SBI board until recently. So you think they will go the whole hog? Would not wanting to maintain control over such a large pool of money, 70 lakh crores, 60 lakh crores, be equally tempting to whichever government?
Look, as long as the government is the dominant or majority owner in banks, it's unrealistic not to expect some sort of political interference. I mean, it's completely unrealistic to think that they will completely stay out of the affairs of banks. But what needs to be done is to counter this through stringent regulation, and that is why I think the RBI, that is where the RBI has an important role to play. I think there are two things which the RBI can do. One is to lay down very stringent fit and proper criteria for membership of bank boards, which will be applicable to anybody who wants to come to a board. So it's okay to have a politician on the board as long as he or she meets fit and proper criteria. And the second thing, which I mentioned, is that you need to address the issue of board effectiveness or boardroom reform. There are one or two things that you need to do there. You need to substantially diversify the composition of bank boards. It should not happen that bank boards are constituted entirely by management or the promoter. You need to bring other stakeholders into the picture in the composition or constitution of bank boards. So let's have representatives for employees, that's already there in public sector banks, and let's also give a say to minority retail shareholders and also to foreign institutional shareholders. So once you limit the number of directors which the promoter, including the government, can put on the board, I think you've gone a long way towards boardroom reform. That is what will help. So boardroom reform or board effectiveness as a counter to any attempts at political interference.
But won't that require amendment of Bank Nationalization Act? I mean, nobody can rightfully get into a bank board. This is only something which the Reserve Bank can maybe enforce through fit and proper rules. But the voting cap, I mean, representation on the board is not linked to the amount of shares you hold at all under the Bank Nationalization Act, isn't it?
Well, yes. I mean, my understanding is that the government has a right to appoint between 2 to 5 directors. And as a matter of self-restraint, you know, the government can choose to limit the number of directors that it puts on the board in consultation with the RBI. So you don't have to use up your full quota of 5. I mean, you can put about 3 people or 3 of your people on the board and then leave it to other stakeholders to constitute independent directors. So then you have better balance and genuine diversity on the board, and that is when boards can stand up in the face of political interference.
That would be hefty large-heartedness and vision that you are asking from the government.
Expecting from the new government, whoever it is. But Mr. Mundra, just coming on this point that Vishal was making about the, you know, the distinct difference between why PSU banks are suffering and some of the private banks are doing better, and the fact that the government needs to give some sort of autonomy to the PSU banks. Do you think this is even possible?
No, in fact, I wanted to basically specifically touch upon those points only. So let's come to the first point of the autonomy. I think almost 5-7 years back, this whole thing was reviewed, and there is a huge misconception that there is no autonomy for the public sector bank to function, and probably each business action which they take is directed from somewhere. I think it is a completely myth. There is a functional autonomy to the board. I would say that ownership, the performance is almost ownership neutral, and to believe, you know, it has become a very common term to say that the politicians are put on the board. If you look at the entire regulation in this and the composition, the people who come, they represent a certain sector. And as far as the Bank of Baroda is concerned, I can always say that Bank of Baroda had always been very lucky to get very right kind of people on the board, and they have guided the bank very well. Now, coming to what my friend was mentioning, that the private sector banks enjoy a lot of autonomy and public sector banks don't have autonomy. I would just like to say, let's go back to 2 years back, and in a complete free capitalist economy, when the banks were enjoying a complete autonomy, where that autonomy has led us to. And it led us to a situation where government was forced to take the control, become the majority shareholder. I think it is a better option that the ownership of the government comes through a legislation in a normal business scenario rather than trying to become, you know, reaching to a situation where they have to take the forced autonomy, forced ownership. And I think cost to income ratio also, I would ask that let us, you know, relook at the figures. There is not a significant difference between the cost to income ratio of a bank of or a large private sector bank.
Mr. Mundra, we are not getting into a competition on that front at all. We are only looking at whether, from what we know of Modi's and the BJP government's functioning, whether we should expect and what we should expect if they were to come to power. Vishal, would you tank up on PSU stocks? Going by what Professor Rammohan is telling us, that Modi very successfully removed politicos from Gujarat state-owned company boards and therefore made for their more professional running. Would you tank up on PSU banks if you were reasonably clear on May 16th that it's a Modi-led or an NDA-led government?
So I think on May 16th we'll take this call, but from what you're saying, for example, in case an NDA government comes on May 16th, I think it makes sense to buy PSUs.
Okay. Professor Rammohan, just one final question. You know, you've been through several cycles of the government and you've seen the way the banking sector has performed. Typically, when a new government comes to power, whoever it is, how much time does it really take for, you know, the new policies to be put in place? And how much time realistically do you think it will take for the new government to stem the problems in the banking sector, such as asset quality, etc.?
Well, it's going to take a fair bit of time. There are two things that you need to do immediately. One is that some sort of bank restructuring of debt has to happen. And you know that in a public sector context, this is not easily accomplished, especially given the sensitivities today about crony capitalism and so on. That's not going to happen easily. But even if that is done, the second thing that you need to do is that fresh funds have to flow into the infrastructure sector. And for that to happen, you know, the capital levels of banks have to be improved. So recapitalization of banks, which is a huge challenge in itself. So I don't see these problems going away in a hurry. Perhaps the positive thing or mitigating factor is that to the extent that the economy begins to recover, the NPA position will improve of its own accord. But I can't see a quick fix to these problems.
All right, gentlemen, at least you have given us the key things that we can expect if it is an NDA government. Thank you very much for joining us in this discussion. So, possible professionalization of boards, hopefully better tackling of NPLs and therefore economic growth, resolving some problems of both NPLs and capital at PSU banks.